And that's equal to what? 16. Good. What's negative 5 when you square it? Negative 5 times a negative 5, which is what? 25. What is 5 squared? It's 5 times 5, which is also 25. Now, if I ask you what is the square root of 25, notice that's a square root. The power is 2 here. What do you think the answer to that is? Is it 5? Just 5? How about the minus 5? Can it be both? Well, the answer is no, because the square root is actually, the principal square root says, when we ask you what's the square root of 25, says give me a positive number. That if you multiply it by itself, the result is 25. Positive number, not negative. So the answer to that's only plus 5. Not a plus or minus. What's the square root of 16? Give me a positive number. If you multiply it by itself, the answer is what? 16. 4. Give me the square root of 9. 3. The square root of 4. 2. The square root of 1. 1. The square root of 0. 0. I shouldn't say positive, give me non-negative. That's a better word to use, non-negative, because 0 is not really a positive number. For the previous one, when I said the 25, I was right. But now it says give me a non-negative number. What's the square root of negative 5? No real solution. You can't take the square root of a negative number. The machine gives you a syntax error or gives you an imaginary solution. Now, if this was not a square root, if this was a cube root, for example, you'll see the number 3 here. That's 3. Cube root. What is the cube root of 8? Now this could be positive or negative. What number if you multiply it by itself 3 times? The answer is 8 plus 2. What is the cube root of negative 8? Nope, it has it. What number if you multiply it by itself 3 times? The answer is 8, negative 2. So you couldn't do the square root of negative number, because what number if you multiply it by itself, the answer is going to be negative? Can't be. A positive times a positive is positive, a negative times a negative is positive. So that's why that can't be. There's no real solution. But the cube root, yes, if that number is odd, you can take actually the nth root of a negative number. Like the 5th root of negative 1. What number if you multiply by itself 5 times? The answer is negative 1. Negative 1. Negative 1 times a negative 1 times a negative 1 times a negative 1 times a negative 1 is negative 1. What is the 4th root of negative 16? fourth root. What number if you multiply it by itself 4 times? Even number. 4 times. Think again. The answer is negative 16. Two times 2 times 2 times 2 is not a negative 16. It will never be negative. So if the root here, this number, if it's an even number like this will, actually has 2, we just don't put it. If it's an even number, there's no real solution. If it's an odd number, you find. Now, sometimes we ask you to simplify a square root. You have a bigger square root and you want to take it down to, reduce your answer. Or it might be the number's too big for you. You can't think off the top of your head. I don't know what the answer to that. So you can break it down. So here's some of the rules for a square root. I'll make it bold and you can't miss it. It says, the square root of AB, or A times B, can be broken down to the square root of A times the square root of B. As long as what? A is greater than 0 and B is greater than 0. If it's 0, there's no reason to break it down. What's 0 times 0? Square root of 0, 0. But if it's something like you're doing a problem, go, my answer is the square root of 50. We go, oh, good. You type this on my math lab, they go, wrong. Why? Because you can break it down. 50 is what? 10 times 5, right? It's not going to help me here, 10 times 5. So you can break it down, the square root of 10 times the square root of 5. Big deal. Does anyone know what the square root of 10 is? No. Does anyone know what the square root of 5 is? No. So that doesn't help me. But wait a minute. 50 is also what? 25 times 2. That's what 50. Do we know what the square root of 25 is? That's a 5. Radical of 2. So you can use that rule to simplify your answer. Or sometimes you're simplifying a problem, you go, my answer at the end, I end up with the square root of 2 times the square root of 3. You go, okay, that's nice. You're not going to write 2 square roots. You can use this rule backward to write it down as the square root of what? 2 times 3, what's 2 times 3? Square root of 6. So instead of typing this twice, you type that one. If you have a minus sign outside the square root, you find. So let's say minus the square root of 100. Here's the minus sign sitting in the front. What is the square root of 100? 10. That's a negative 10. Now, the rule we use for a square root, the reason we said the square root cannot be negative because of this. The square root of x squared, according to our book, is the absolute value of x. And the absolute value is always what? Positive. That's why when I ask you the first question, what's the square root of 25? I said it's not a plus or minus 5. It's only a plus 5. Because of this definition. If we assume that x is positive, if somebody said assume x is positive, do I have to put the absolute value of x there? No. So if they're saying if x is positive, then the square root of x squared will be what? Just x. You don't have to write the absolute because they're telling us x is a positive number. What's the absolute value of 5? 5. What's the absolute value of 9? 9. So if we know x is positive, there is no reason to put the absolute value sign there. So let's practice some of these. What's a square root? Assume, I'll put this on the top. All the variables I'm going to be using are positive numbers or positive values. What's the square root of x to the 4th? What do you think? Here is what the square root means. The square root means what? The power of, anyone? Not 2. Notice if you have a calculator, suddenly the square root doesn't work and you want to do the problem. You raise it to the power of what? 1/2. So that's x to the 4th to the power of what? 1/2. And what's 4 times 1/2? X squared. What's the square root of y to the 10? So it's y to the 10 to what power? 1/2. And what's the answer? Y to the 5th. So to find the square root of a variable, take that power and just divide it by 2. I don't have to go through all this gibberish stuff. What's the square root of t to the 8th? Divide the power by 2, that's what? T to the 4th. What is the square root of x to the 6th? Y to the 10. Remember, you can break this one down, the square root of x to the 6 times the square root of y to the 10, using that rule there. And the square root of x to the 6 is what? What's half the 6? Is it 3? So it's x to the 3rd, y to what power? What's half of 10? 5. If they ask you to approximate, if the problem says approximate, the square root of 3, you really need a calculator. You can't do it without a calculator. And if you get a calculator, you hit the square root of 3, and if you round it to 4 decimal places or 3 decimal places, Is it 1.732? I think something like that. Yeah. But you will need a calculator. What you're going to see us write, instead of that equal, it will not be equal. We're going to write squiggly line. What's a squiggly line means? Approximately. Approximately. If they say, give me the exact answer, of the square root 27, exact answer, you can't use the calculator, because the calculator is going to round that for you. It's going to be approximately. So 27, you got to think about it. How can I simplify 27? What two numbers, if you multiply them, the answer is 27? Is it 9 and 3? 9 times 3? So I should be able to break this one down to the square root of 9 times the square root of 3. What is the square root of 9? 3, the square root of 3. I'm looking at peeking at the book here, and this is 6. It doesn't look like they're adding radicals and subtracting radicals. Let me just take a quick look at it. No, they're not adding. The only addition I see a problem that looks like this. Now, this is definitely wrong. If you break it down, does not equal. It's wrong. Does not equal the square root 25 plus the square root of 9. Does not. Because what's the square root 25? It's actually 5. What is the square root of 9? 3. What's 5 plus 3? 8. If you add 25 and 9, what's the answer? 34. And let me see, this cheap calculator has a square root of 34. Let's see, 34, hit square root, and it says 5.83. That's why they don't equal to each other. They're not. So you can't break an addition or subtractions when you have a square root. You can only do multiplication and division. Our book doesn't show us the division, but I'll add it there anyway. You never know if we need it or not. And it says if you want to divide the square root of a over b, can be broken down to the square root of a over the square root of b. You can work back and forth. So if somebody said to us, what is the square root of 4 nines? I go, okay, that's the square root of 4 over the square root of 9. What is the square root of 4? 2. What's the square root of 9? 3. It's 2/3. Or if somebody comes to us and says, what is the square root of 27 divided by the square root of 75? Work it backward. I have two options here. I can simplify the 27. 27 is what? 9 times 3, right? And that'll be a 3, the square root of 3. And the 75 is what? 25 times 3. And the square root 25, which is what? 5, the radical of 3. And what do you notice about the radical of 3? Gone. 3 over 5. That's one way of doing it. If you don't like what I did to this problem, I'll show you a different way. I can make it one fraction, 27 over 75. And now you can divide both of these. Right now you can divide them by 3. If you divide both of these by 3, that'll be what? 9 over 25. Break it down to the square root of 9 over the square root 25, which is 3 over 5. That's all we have to know according to our book from this section.